Okay, we're going to go live a little bit early again, just a few minutes early, and let people shuffle in. We are in class 6, but really it's the second in the material of the class. We are just diving into behaviorism. You can check out the earlier. Oh, actually, why don't I pull up the slides for this and I'll show you what we're doing. Slides. That would be the wrong slides. Okay, here we go. So we're doing philosophy of mind. There we go. And what we're covering in the sections, we've done the historical background, which wasn't the best collection, but the rest of this book is really good. And those are the first 4 videos, I think. And now we've done one on behaviorism, and we're going to discuss behaviorism and mind brain identity. And we're going to look at behaviorism from the pros and the cons. We read a really fantastic essay last time by Carl Hempel talking about behaviorism and defining it and relating it to psychological behaviorism, which is a different thing. Uh, but there's a lot of overlap. So essentially, Savad's going to be here in a moment, and we're going to get started with Philosophy of Mind, which is a year 1 course that is being done in the year 1 style to dive a little bit deeper into mind body issues than just the intro. Backbone course allowed us to go. So that's what we're doing. And we're just going to we're going to get through behaviorism and functionalism. We're going to do a section on artificial intelligence, interpretationism, eliminativism. We're going to look at externalism and mental content. We're going to look at subjectivity and self-knowledge, consciousness itself, and we'll have a lot to talk about there. Reductionism, and then we're going to look at some possibilities that materialism is untenable, perhaps, or maybe not, and the mind body problem isn't even a solvable problem. So those are the sections that we're looking at, and we're just going to wait for Savad to get here. Here's some of the names we're going to be reading in this course. This is the 6th course, but really you didn't miss much except for the last video, because this is when we just got into behaviorism. So we're in the behaviorism section now. We're going to be really reading an essay by Hilary Putnam today. Savad will be here in a moment, and we'll get started proper. But last week we read an article called "The Logical Analysis of Psychology" by Carl Hempel, which was really a defining and pro argument about behaviorism. So we're going to look at behaviorism from different points of criticism and promotion in this section, and we're going to get a good definition of this type of an approach. It was essentially mostly replaced by functionalism after this, but it's a really great place to start. And so we've actually got some great things we're reading right now. I'm not sure I like the author's collection of the historical background section. It didn't seem exactly fair enough. But it was a little bit tokeny at parts. But in any event, we got through that. And last week we started our behaviorism section, and this will be the second essay in behaviorism that we're doing today. We can remove that. Savad will be here in just a moment, and then we'll get started. Let's see here. Let me just let him know we are live. It's good heads up. So that's what we're doing. And so before he gets here, on Thursdays, we're doing this year 1 material, which is very much looking at, cherry picked essays and excerpts on various subjects. The Backbone course does that over, 8 different fields. And we finished with determinism and free will. We finished with the mind body problem. We finished with and here we go. Savad's here. So we're going to get started. Hey, brother, how's it going?
Good. How you doing?
Great. Let me just remove this now. I was just letting people know what we're up to. So this is our Thursday class on philosophy of mind, where we do a little bit of a deeper survey and introduction into mind philosophy. And we're gonna continue with behaviorism today, and it's getting kind of fun now. So let's get into it. If the lighting will work. All righty. So that last essay was pretty good, I think. It was pretty good advance of behaviorism. Like we said, behaviorism has some problems, and we're going to start to explore what those are and talk about behaviorism from different aspects in this section. But then that'll lead us into functionalism, which is essentially what it's a little bit of a simplification, but what it more or less, was replaced by. Okay. Hillary Putnam, a name which we will start to get used to seeing. Brains and behavior. Once upon a time, there was a tough minded philosopher who said, "What is all this talk about minds, ideas, and sensations? Really, and I mean really, in the real world, there is nothing to these so called mental events and entities, but certain processes of our all too material heads." And once upon a time, there was a philosopher who retorted, "What a masterpiece of confusion! Even if, say, pain were perfectly correlated with any particular event in my brain, which I doubt, that event would obviously have certain properties, say a certain numerical intensity measured in volts, which it would be senseless to ascribe to the feeling of pain. Thus, it is two things that are correlated, not one. And to call two things one thing is worse than to be mistaken. It is an utter contradiction." For a long time, dualism and materialism appeared to exhaust the alternatives. Compromises were attempted. Double aspect theories, we've looked at those, remember, in our intro course, the backbone course. But they never won many converts, and practically no one found them intelligible. Then, in the mid 1930s, a seeming a third possibility was discovered. The third possibility has been called logical behaviorism. To state the nature of this third possibility briefly, it is necessary to recall the treatment of the natural numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. in modern logic. Numbers are identified with sets in various ways depending on which authority one allows or one follows. For instance, Whitehead and Russell identified 0 with the set of all empty sets. 1 with the set of all one-membered sets, 2 with the set of all two-membered sets, 3 with the set of all three-membered sets, and so on. This has the appearance of circularity, but they were able to dispel so sorry. But they were able to dispel this appearance by defining one-membered set, two-membered set, three-membered set, etc., without using 1, 2, or 3, etc. In short, numbers are treated as logical constructions out of sets. The number theorist is doing set theory without knowing it, according to this interpretation. Now, let's leave that aside for a moment, except to say that Dr. Tartaglia is on his way. He's on his way. I just remembered I have to meet with him later tonight. Um, he's going to be giving us a class on Gödel soon and the incompleteness theorem and how to derive it. And in order to do all of that properly, he has to talk about formal systems. And some of the formal systems talk is going to be related to what he's been referring to. Essentially, there were a group of logicians who tried to derive all of mathematics from, uh, I won't say it as correctly as he will. So maybe I'll leave him. Let's let's not say inaccurate things. We'll leave him to teach it to us, but I'll just say they tried to find a basis for all of mathematics outside of assuming numerical concepts, something similar to that. Okay. So in any event, what was novel about this was the idea of getting rid of certain philosophically unwanted or embarrassing entities, numbers, without failing to do justice to the appropriate body of discourse. That's number theory, by treating the entities in question as logical constructions. Russell was quick to hold up this success as a model to all future philosophers, and certain of those future philosophers, the Vienna positivists, in their physicalist phase about 1930, took Russell's advice so seriously as to produce the doctrine that we are calling logical behaviorism. The doctrine that, just as numbers are allegedly logical constructions out of sets, so mental events are logical constructions out of actual and possible behavior events. We read a lot about the Vienna Circle and the logical positivists in the last essay. They clearly play a role here. Their failure or demise or just the turning of the wheel past their it was really quite a heady thing to be a part of, I think, at the time. And it was really a fascinating movement in philosophy. And Dr. Tartaglia is going to have a lot to tell us about that because he also has a Quine class coming up. And Quine sort of picked up the rubble of what they were doing and maybe rescued what might have been valuable about it from Tartaglia's perspective and started moving it forward before everything just sort of got um, stopped. This is his conversation with me the other day by the postmodernist nihilistic, let's just say everything is meaningless crowd. So by taking his Quine class instead of my third year Nietzsche class, when that's finally available as an alternative to the third year, there's a really exciting possibility where people could say, okay, let's just try to figure out where people were advancing this from Quine and the people who took it slightly after Quine and see if we can't, just sort of pick up where they left off before everybody said everything is nonsense. So that's going to be quite interesting. But in any event, he'll be here to help us out with the Vienna Circle a bit more in the near future. All right. In the set theoretic case, the reduction of number theory to the appropriate part of set theory was carried out in detail and with indisputable technical success. It was really quite a thing they accomplished there. One may dispute the philosophical significance of the reduction, but one knows exactly what one is talking about when one disputes it. In the mind body case, the reduction was never carried out in even one possible way, so that it is not possible to be clear on just how mental entities or events are to be identified with logical constructions out of behavior events. But broadly speaking, it is clear what the view implies. It implies that all talk about mental events is translatable into talk about actual or potential overt behavior. Okay, so we can see how closely related this is to everything in the behaviorism article that we read yesterday. But there's actually a theoretical underpinning that's being presented to us here. In other words, what they're trying to do, if they're able to do it, is say, just like these logical positivists were able to reduce number theories into set theory, w- what we think we can do is take all talk about mental events, all talk about mental happenings and mental instantiations, everything mental, and we could reduce it properly into physicalistic conversation about behaviors, things that can be measured. And if we can do that successfully, which it's not clear, as he says, that anybody's been able to even come close to doing that, but this is what they thought they would be able to do because so much success was being made in these directions, especially in the Vienna Circle, is to say, hey, fantastic. Now we've turned psychology into a hard science. Well, let's see. Let's see how well they do. You can see why it would be nice to be able to do something like that, perhaps, if at least if you're a scientist, right? If you want your science to be like physics, and in the last essay, they argued, they think successfully, that psychology is a branch of physics, because remember, last time it was all of the psychological terms that have any meaning are translatable into physicalistic terminology without losing any of the content. So, just to remind ourselves from last week, because this is what we want to keep in our mind here, being in pain is a reference between two people who understand how to use the term to all the ways you might verify if someone is in pain, which are all physicalistic measurement things. Like they answer the question, yeah, my tooth hurts, or they jump up and down and hold their toe going, owie, 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 or whatever. Just anything behavioral that can be measured, including maybe things that you can measure in a brain scan or something. Anything that is measurable is what we mean, and there's nothing more we mean about being in pain than that. That's basically the behaviorist position. And I don't think I've shared this joke yet, but I'm not going to do it to try to insult behaviorism, but rather to help make clear, just to make sure it's clear in all our minds what the behaviorists are actually claiming here and what they're seriously claiming and what they're writing as if they believe and what they're trying to establish about the mind. Uh, this might be unfair, but here's how the joke goes. The behaviorists believe that what it means, what the psychological terms mean, if they mean anything, are only references to the ways that you could measure whether or not you could observe whether or not the term is applying. And they don't mean anything beyond that. right? So when they say you're in pain, they don't mean, oh, yeah, you're having that type of an experience that I subjectively feel I'm having that maybe I can't describe except with poetry or something. That's just meaningless. Like, it's not that you're right or wrong that you have an internal experience like that. The words don't mean anything if that's what you're talking about. What you're talking about when you're communicating between people, they think, and this was their Wittgensteinian analysis of the language of the scientists and how they find meaning with each other when they're communicating, is only merely and to the degree that you're referencing things the other person understands are verifiable through the measurement of something physical. So the joke goes, B.F. Skinner is lying in bed with his wife, and he turns to his wife and he says, "That was good for you. Was it good for me?" Because she's in a privileged position to observe whether or not he had a good time. He has less access to the knowledge of whether or not he was having a good time or whether or not he experienced pleasure or anything like that. But he can observe her and uh, the measurable observations about whether or not she was having a good time. So that was good for you. Was it good for me? But that is really what they're trying to say. They're trying to say jumping up and down and holding your toe and maybe having a certain neurological brain scan signal or responding to a questionnaire by saying yes, I'm in a lot of pain. Those are all different evidences that would add up to, oh yeah, this person's in pain, and that's all pain means. That's really the key to behaviorism. Behaviorism is saying that's all it means. It's not also referring to something meaningful beyond that. That's what the word means. That's all it could mean. Okay. It is easy to see in what way the view differs from both dualism and classical materialism. The logical behaviorist agrees with the dualist that what goes on in our brains has no connection whatever with what we mean when we say that someone is in pain. He can even take over the dualist's entire stock of arguments against the materialist position. Yet, at the same time, he can be as tough minded as the materialist in denying that ordinary talk of pains, thoughts, and feelings involves reference to mind as a Cartesian substance. Remember, Descartes had this idea of a thing of mind, but it was not material. So it had no location or length, breadth, or width. It wasn't like material things, but it was a mental substance. This is like, you don't even have to think that in order to still be of one mind between these two camps. Okay. Thus, it is not surprising that logical behaviorism attracted as a as an alternative enormous attention, both pro and con, during the next 30 years. Without doubt, this alternative proved to be a fruitful one to inject into the debate. Here, however, my intention is not to talk about the fruitfulness of the investigations to which logical behaviorism has led, but to see if there was any upshot to those investigations. Can we, after 30 years, say anything about the rightness or wrongness of logical behaviorism? Or must we say that a third alternative has to be added to the old two? That we cannot decide between three any more easily than we could decide between two, and that our discussion is thus half as difficult again as it was before. So that's what he's going to explore in this essay. That's cool. One conclusion emerged very quickly from the discussion pro and con logical behaviorism, that the extreme thesis of logical behaviorism, as we have just stated it, that all talk about mental events is translatable into talk about overt behavior, is false. But in a sense, this is not very interesting. An extreme thesis may be false, although there is something to the way of thinking that it represents. And the more interesting question is this: what, if anything, can be saved of the way of thinking that logical behaviorism represents? That's a really good question. All right. We're not here to say, oh, this view's wrong, this view's right necessarily. We'll say, okay, well, wait a minute. This is a complicated thing trying to understand the mind. Are there some insights we can get from this approach that we couldn't get as easily from other approaches? Are there germs of truth that they have a privileged access to notice? And shouldn't we latch on to those, even maybe latch on to identifying the method by which they were able to see them, and then try to incorporate them into whatever sort of view we end up settling with, or maybe consider that they could be right or whatever. It's there's more interesting things to say than just I vote up or down on this idea. And so I quite agree with him on that. And that's how we're going to look at all these sections, trying to understand the mind. And we may find some that we are prejudiced to really like, and some that we are prejudiced to really dislike. But whatever our attitude towards any of these perspectives, what we should be doing is really looking for, okay, wait a minute, what do they have to say here that I wouldn't have noticed otherwise, and how can I respond to that even if I don't agree with their perspective and or whatever. So let's see. The other debate about whether or not it's right or wrong is also interesting as well, obviously. In the last 30 years, the original extreme thesis of logical behaviorism has gradually been weakened to something like this. One, that there exist entailments between mind statements and behavior statements, entailments that are not perhaps analytic in the way in which all bachelors are unmarried is analytic, but that nevertheless follow in some sense from the meanings of the mind words. We shall call these analytic entailments. All right, so let's pause there on that first one. That's an interesting almost inevitable obvious truth of the behaviorist approach, isn't it? That if I was using mental words, words about your mind state or your mental experiences, even folk psychology terminology, or no matter how I was using it, if those terms had absolutely no reference to anything that could be measured at all or observed at all, it doesn't exactly follow that the terms are meaningless, but it certainly becomes more difficult to see what it is that they mean, and it's likely that they might be meaningless. You see? So he said, look, let's call them analytic entailments. Necessary, not full definition, not all there is to the mental term, perhaps. Maybe the behaviors were a bit wrong there, perhaps, but that we could identify observable entailments that are always connected to some mental terms or something like that. Okay, that's a good start. I don't think you'd have to be a behaviorist to recognize that, but you might have to be a behaviorist to stress the importance of identifying it. All right, that these entailments may not so too that these entailments may not provide an actual translation of mind talk into behavior talk. This talk was introduced by Gilbert Ryle in his concept of mind, but that this is true for such superficial reasons as the greater ambiguity of mind talk as the as compared with the relatively greater specificity of overt behavior talk. Okay, so not only are there entailments, but obviously, if we're going to try to be scientists and we're going to try to measure out experiments and talk about what you can observe, it would be real good for us to be spending a lot of our time talking about things that you could repeat in your lab, since that's the whole basis of, that's one of the major inexorable elements of actually being able to do science. I can't just give you a nice story. It has to be something you could replicate, which means that you have to be able to have observable outcomes, that you have to measure how you got to them, and that they should line up with what I mean, that's right. Okay, if there are physical observable entailments to these mental concepts, let's pay a lot of attention to them if we're going to try to scienceify this psychology. And again, maybe there's people who say, well, that's an error. It's dream talk, and you want to have. It's. I feel like psychology kind of has one foot in science and one foot in mytho poetry. But even if that were the case, nobody is going to raise the cry against saying, hey, if we could get some real scientific progress going here, that can't be a bad thing for the field. So, and it would make sense that we would want to emphasize these what they're calling behavioral entailments. Okay, cool. I believe that although no philosopher would today subscribe to the older version of logical behaviorism, a great many philosophers would accept these 2 points while admitting the unsatisfactory imprecision of the present statement of both of them. If these philosophers are right, then there is much work to be done. Example, the notion of analyticity has to be made clear, but the direction of work is laid out for us for some time to come. I wish that I could share this happy point of view, if only for the comforting conclusion that first rate philosophical research continued for some time will eventually lead to a solution to the mind body problem, which is independent of troublesome empirical facts about brains, central causation of behavior, evidence for and against non physical causation of at least some behavior, and the soundness or unsoundness of physical research and parapsychology. But the fact is that I come to bury logical behaviorism, not to praise it. I feel that the time has come for us to admit that logical behaviorism is a mistake, and that even the weakened forms of the logical behaviorist doctrine are incorrect. I cannot hope to establish this in so short a paper as this one, but I hope to expose for your introspection, I'm sorry, for your inspection, at least the main lines of my thinking. Okay, so we read a really strong argument pro behaviorism last essay. Here we go with a big attack against it. Let's see what he says. Logical behaviorism. The logical behaviorist usually begins by pointing out what is perfectly true, that such words as pain will henceforth be our stock example of a mind word, are not taught by reference to standard examples in the way in which such words as red are. One can point to a standard red thing, but when one cannot point to a standard pain, that is, except by pointing to some piece of behavior and say, compare the feeling you are having with this one. Say Jones's feeling of time at time t sub 2 or t sub 1 with the two feelings. I'm sorry. If the two feelings have the identical quality, then your feeling is legitimately called a feeling of pain. The difficulty, of course, is that I cannot have Jones's feeling at time t sub 1 unless I am Jones, and the time is t sub 1. Let me put this in other words really quickly, although it's pretty obvious what he's saying. It's by definition not possible to have someone else's subjective experience. So if the pain term is about what it feels like to me, I can't really talk about that in a meaningful, well, maybe non-lyrical symphonic music, or maybe poetry. Maybe there's other languages in art that use some kind of metaphorical form creation analogy thing. I don't know, whatever it might be, but it's certainly not something we can talk about like, oh, hey, go get me a beaker of, pain measurement juice and let's see what color it comes out under the litmus paper. Okay. So from this simple observation, certain things follow. For example, the account according to which the intention of the word pain is a certain quality, we're going to remember that word, which I know from my own case must be wrong. But this is not to refute dualism, since the dualist need not maintain that I know the intention of the English word pain from my own case, but only that I experience the referent of the word. This is all an argument about the referent of the word, right? The behaviorist says the word pain, inasmuch as it means something, is referring to a set of mutually understood ways of empirically verifying the situation of the individual under question between two people who understand how to use the word properly. All right. You can see how they're analyzing the language usage of psychologists to try to get to that conclusion. But what Putnam is saying here is no, the word pain, as everybody knows, is referring to a subjective experience and the quality of that experience that you're having. Everybody knows that's what you're talking about. That's its meaning. Okay. I don't know what analysis you did on the way psychologists were talking to each other and what they took each other to mean, but we know what the word means. It's referring to that experiential thing that you've had before, I assume. From this simple observation, certain things follow. For example, the account according to which the intention of the word pain is to a certain quality, which I know from my own case must be wrong. But this is not to refute dualism since the reference of pain. Okay. What then is the intention of pain? I am inclined to say that pain, as a word, is a cluster concept. That is, the application of the word pain is controlled by a whole cluster of criteria, all of which can be regarded as synthetic. As a consequence, there is no satisfactory way of answering the question, what does pain mean? Except by giving an exact synonym, Schmerz, for example. But there are a million and one different ways of saying what pain is. One can, for example, say that pain is that feeling which is normally evinced by saying ouch, or by wincing, or in a variety of other ways, or often not evinced at all. All this is compatible with logical behaviorism. The logical behaviorist would reply, exactly. Pain is a cluster concept. That is to say, it stands for a cluster of phenomena. But that is not what I mean. Let us look at another kind of cluster concept. Cluster concepts, of course, are not a homogeneous class, names of diseases. So let's look at names of diseases as a cluster concept. We observe that when a virus origin was discovered for polio, doctors said that certain cases in which all the symptoms of polio had been present, but in which the virus had been absent, had turned out not to be cases of polio at all. Similarly, if a virus should be discovered, which normally, almost invariably, is the cause of what we presently call multiple sclerosis, the hypothesis that this virus is the cause of multiple sclerosis would not be falsified if, in some few exceptional circumstances, it was possible to have all the symptoms of multiple sclerosis for some other combination of reasons, or if this virus caused symptoms not presently recognized as symptoms of multiple sclerosis in some cases. These facts would certainly lead the lexicographer to reject the view that multiple sclerosis means the simultaneous presence of such and such symptoms. Rather, he would say that multiple sclerosis means that disease which is normally responsible for some or all of the following symptoms, dot, dot, dot. Of course, he does not have to say this. Some philosophers would prefer to say that polio used to mean the simultaneous presence of such and such symptoms. And they would say that the decision to accept the presence or absence of a virus as a criterion for the presence or absence of polio represented a change of meaning. But this runs strongly counter to our common sense. For example, doctors used to say, I believe polio is caused by a virus. On the change of meaning account, those doctors were wrong, not right. Polio, as the word was then used, was not always caused by a virus. It is only what we call polio that is always caused by a virus. And if a doctor ever said, and many did, I believe this may not be a case of polio, knowing that all the textbook symptoms were present, that doctor must have been contradicting himself. All right, let's be clear about what he's saying here. He's saying, okay, this is kind of a fun philosophical move he's making. He's saying, okay, these logical positivists are analyzing language and the way it's being used. Well, let's do that. Let's play their game for a moment here. If we don't know the cause of polio, and you're a doctor and I'm a doctor and we're both investigating it, and you say, I think it's caused by a virus. And on another day, I'm looking at a patient with all the symptoms of polio, and I say, I don't think this patient has polio. I think they have something else. Both of those statements are either wrong or absurd. If the definition of polio before we discovered the virus meant the collection of symptoms. What it has to be, and what our common sense, as he points out, tells us, is that we didn't know the origin of polio. We discovered it was a virus. The term polio didn't change its meaning from a collection of symptoms to a thing that's present when this virus is causing you to be sick and have those symptoms, right? It didn't change its meaning. We just discovered something true about polio. Polio kept the same meaning. It was a disease. We didn't know what caused it at first. But if it changed its meaning and you suspected it was caused by a virus, well, it's not clear that that's either, it could be right, I think. He's saying it's wrong, but it's not clear it's meaningful. I think logically it might translate into something like, let's take the second example. It's easier. If I say this patient has all the symptoms of polio, but I don't think they really have polio. Well, if what polio means is having these symptoms, well, then what I'm saying is this patient has polio and I don't think they have polio, which is contradictory and absurd. Rather, what I was saying originally, as he says, common sense says, is I don't know the origin of polio. This patient certainly looks like they have polio, but we don't know what causes polio. And I think that something else might cause symptoms that look a lot like polio. And I think that's what this person might have for some reason. Okay. So I believe this may not be a case of polio, but also this account runs counter to good linguistic methodology. The definition we proposed a paragraph back, multiple sclerosis, means the disease that is normally responsible for the following symptoms. That has an exact analog to the case of polio. This kind of definition leaves open the question whether there is a single cause or several. It is it is consonant with such a definition to speak of discovering a single origin for polio, or two, or three, or four. To speak of discovering X did not have polio, although he exhibited all the symptoms of polio. And to speak of discovering X did have polio, although he exhibited none of the textbook symptoms. And finally, such a definition does not require us to say that any change of meaning took place. Thus, this is surely the definition that a good lexicographer would adopt. But this entails rejecting the change of meaning account as a philosopher's invention. Accepting that this is the correct account of the names of diseases, what follows? There may be analytic entailments connecting diseases and symptoms, although I shall argue against this. For example, it looks plausible to say that normally people who have multiple sclerosis have some or all of the following symptoms, is a necessary analytic truth. But it does not follow that disease talk is translatable into symptom talk. Rather, the contrary follows, as is already indicated by the presence of the word normally. Statements about multiple sclerosis are not translatable into statements about the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, but because disease talk is systematically ambiguous and symptom talk is specific, but because causes are not logical constructions out of their effects. In analogy with the foregoing, both the dualist and the materialist would want to argue that although the meaning of pain may be explained by reference to overt behavior, what we mean by pain is not the presence of a cluster of responses, but rather the presence of an event or condition that normally causes those responses. Of course, the pain is not the whole cause of the pain behavior, but only a suitably invariant part of that cause. But similarly, the virus caused tissue damage is not the whole cause of the individual symptoms of polio in some individual cases, but a suitably invariant part of the cause. And they would want to argue further that even if it were a necessary truth that normally when one says ouch, one has a pain, or a necessary truth that normally when one has a pain, one says ouch, this would be an interesting observation about what pain means, but it would shed no metaphysical light on what pain is or isn't. And it certainly would not follow that pain talk is translatable into response talk, or that the failure of translatability is only a matter of the systematic ambiguity of pain talk as opposed to the specificity of response talk. Quite the contrary. Just as before, causes, that's the pains, are not logical constructions out of their effects, which are the behaviors. The traditional dualist would, however, want to go further and deny the necessity of the two propositions just listed. Moreover, the traditional dualist is right. There is nothing self-contradictory, as we shall see below, in talking of hypothetical worlds in which there are pains, but no pain behavior. All right. In this, so we haven't seen a lot of this yet, but we're about to see a lot of this. In fact, Putnam is giving us a lot of contemporary philosophical language that's used a lot in, peer review, published, well cited philosophical journal articles in our present day. And some of the talk is about hypothetical worlds. And we're going to get really, really used to hypothetical world talk in the philosophy of mind course that we're doing here. There's going to be lots of other philosophers who are some are going to base their entire philosophical point and reasoning off of that type of talk, but many will use it as a way of talking. So we just got introduced to it for the first time. It's a nice little thing to highlight. We'll be seeing lots more of it. He's also done a few others, examples of things like that earlier. So what he's saying is there's no logical contradiction in talking about a hypothetical world, not our world, but a hypothetical world where there are pains, but no pain behavior measurable, observable, outcomes or correlates. The behaviorists are going to deny that. They're not going to deny that it's contradictory. They're going to deny that it would be meaningful. So let's put this aside and actually do this since he's using. Let's do this. It'll help. So I'll play the behaviorist for a moment. We'll put on the behaviorist hat and say, okay, let's imagine a world just like our world in many ways, in almost every way. Except in this world, there are creatures just like us in almost every way. We have cities and houses and jobs and things we do. And when we stub our toes in that other world, when the creatures of that other world stub their toes, they experience, you're telling me, the same internal sensation of pain that I experience when I stub my toe. They all feel pain in exactly the same ways we do. The qualities are the same. There's maybe a correlate. There's a let's talk about Earth 2. And on Earth 2, there's Savad 2 and there's Zara 2. And when Savad 2 stubs his toe on Earth 2, he has the same kind of internal experience that Savad here has when he stubs his toe in the same way. Same with my correlate. But the difference is on Earth 2, none of the people there ever show a sign of ever being in pain. They don't wince, their blood pressure doesn't rise, their faces don't have signs of any muscular distortion or flushing of any kind. They don't get more short-tempered. They don't have a CAT scan doesn't reveal that something's happened in their brain. None of the things that happen when we experience pain happen to them. They never go, "Ow, ow, ow, my toe." They just keep walking as if nothing had happened. And yet, the experience of pain is something that is happening in their brain, because that's what you're talking about. So the behaviorist is saying, okay, you're talking about the experience, the quality, the subjective thing. Well, um, I think you're insane. I think that makes no sense, says the behaviorist. The behaviorist says, what are you talking about? In what way could they possibly be experiencing pain? Pain is something that draws your attention towards the source of the pain. You have signs of it. You say, "Ouch," you don't like it. How can you really have the same experience if what you do is walk along like nothing has happened? If you were to stub your toe and walk along like nothing has happened, it means your toe is anesthetized and you didn't feel any pain. How can you how could it be meaningful to say that they have pain? How do you know they have pain? You're telling me they have pain, but the word doesn't mean anything if it doesn't mean something that we could be referring to that we could both observe independently. But what Putnam is saying is, no, okay, you think it's meaningless, but what I want to point out is there's no logical contradiction in it. There's nothing about saying they're having the experience, but it's let's call it earth stoicism. They just completely accept the painful experience and they show no sign of it. They don't talk about it. They don't write poetry about it. They don't cry about it. They don't wince. Their blood pressure doesn't rise. They have just accepted the painful elements of being in its entirety, and they just show no signs. There's no sign that could possibly be shown. Now, you might think that's crazy. You might not. You might think it's extremely unlikely. But Putnam is saying there's no logical impossibility. What I'm saying is not self-contradictory. You know what I'm talking about. That's not a I'm not talking about square circles here, right? If I was talking about square circles, you could say you're not talking about anything. That means nothing. It couldn't mean anything. I'm talking about a world that could exist. I'm not saying it does, but it could. All right, so that's the point he's making here. So his point is that there's no logical, this is why we'll talk about other worlds, is there's no reason to think that that world couldn't be possible. And so it's to illustrate, well, maybe many things, but one of the things it illustrates is the fact that what pain is referring to is not just the outward signs. The analogy with names of diseases is still preserved at this point. Suppose I identify multiple sclerosis as the disease that normally produces certain symptoms. If it later turns out that a certain virus is the cause of multiple sclerosis, Using this newly discovered criterion, I may then go on to find out that multiple sclerosis has quite different symptoms when, say, the average temperature is low. I can then perfectly well talk of a hypothetical world with low temperature levels in which multiple sclerosis does not normally produce the usual symptoms. It is true that if the words multiple, oh, that's such an interesting idea. Okay. Oh, that's so interesting. So imagine a disease, we don't know the cause of it, but we recognize what the symptoms are. And we say, well, I can tell if a person has this disease because I'm a doctor and I look for the symptoms they got this disease. You say, but doctor, how do you know they have the disease if you don't know what causes the disease? You say, well, look, I'm just saying they have the disease. Oh, all right. One moment, very briefly. Okay. Um, so what if we don't know what the cause of the disease is, but we know what the symptoms are, right? He's making an analogy between the behaviorists saying we don't know what the quality of the experience is or the subjective, whatever you think you're referring to, but we know what the behaviors are that correlate to it. He says, okay, but when now hold on a second. What if 2% of people get this disease and you can tell when they have it because they have all the symptoms? So you admit them into the hospital and you treat them and you try to help them and blah, blah, blah. But what if it turns out that 15% of the population actually has the disease? Well, how can that be? Only 2% have symptoms. Everybody else looks fine. Well, it turns out if you discover what the cause of the disease is, you could identify actually 15% of the population has it, but um if you live further than 60 degrees away from the equator, it's too cold for the disease to trigger the symptoms in you. You have the disease. If you move south or north, if you move towards the equator, you're gonna have to go to the hospital, but we now know you have the disease, but you always had the disease, but you never had the symptoms. Now, let's go back to his other worlds. What if every time we experience pain, we show some elements of the collective set of outwardly observable signs of being in pain? But what if that's only because we live in a region of the solar system that is bounded by some sort of pain consciousness inducive field that we've never discovered yet? But if we were to travel out towards Jupiter and beyond the Kuiper belt, maybe past Pluto, we would realize that we had gone out of that. And now our psychology is no longer affected by that region. We laugh about the fact that we don't feel pain anymore or that it makes us feel a pleasant sensation instead of a harmful one. We're not saying that's true. We're saying there's nothing logically incompatible with that, right? There's nothing where we would say, "Oh, now I've come to a greater understanding. Pain is not just something hurt me, but um, there's also other things that have to go along for the pain sensation to actually happen and then make me make those behaviors." Right? So the signal will still go to my brain. I'll still have the subjective experience of pain, maybe, but none of the outward signs will happen. That's what I meant to say. So I go, "Owie, that really hurts," but as soon as I'm outside that region where my psychology hasn't been affected by certain waves that I don't even know exist or have an effect, it's all hypothetical. None of this has to be true, right? It's a thought experiment. But let's say that for some reason, if your brain is in another part of the cosmos, the way it functions is always with the background radiation or something, but it's different in that area than it is here. It's all nonsense. None of this has to even sound reasonable. The point is, in that field, all of your behaviors are different. Maybe the same experience of pain happens and it hurts, but when it hurts, all of the outward signs of what you do when you're having a pleasurable experience is what you show outwardly rather than the pain experience. Maybe they're swapped in a consciousness polarity shift or some nonsense thing like that, right? The whole point of this talk is not it's important to know nothing that Putnam is saying requires anything that absurd to actually be the reality. What he's saying is if you do that thought experiment, you'll realize that when we were talking about pain, we weren't just talking about the outward experience, the outward signs of the experience. We're talking about the experience itself. Okay. So it's a fun way to talk about that, I suppose. In some way, it's true that if explanation suggests the analogy develops. Where do we go with the disease? Okay. I can then perfectly well talk of a hypothetical world with lower temperature levels in which multiple sclerosis does not normally produce the usual symptoms. It is true that if the words multiple sclerosis are used in any world in such a way that the above lexical definition is a good one, then many victims of the disease must have had some or all of the following symptoms. And in the same way, it is true that if the explanation suggests of the word pain is the explanation suggested of the word pain is a good one, i.e., pain is the feeling that is normally being evinced when someone says ouch or winces or screams and see, then persons in pain must have at some time winced or screamed or said ouch. But this does not imply that if someone has ever had a pain, then someone must at some time have winced or screamed or said, ouch. To conclude, this would be to confuse preconditions for talking about pain as we talk about pain with preconditions for the existence of pain. So he's trying to take the axe to the root of these behaviorists because what he's talking about is that they would respond with, of course, that's exactly what we did. We analyzed the way we were talking about it to find out what was the meaning of the words. Well, he's saying, well, why don't I do some other philosophical games with the meaning of the words and realize that you can't possibly be right. It can't just be reduced to the outward signs. And so he's meeting their analysis of the meaning of the word game with his own insights. The analogy we have been developing is not an identity. Linguistically speaking, mind words and the names of diseases are different in a great many respects. In particular, first person uses are very different. A man may have a severe case of polio and not know it, even if he knows the word polio, but one cannot have a severe pain and not know it. At first blush, this may look like a point in favor of logical behaviorism. The logical behaviorist may say it is because the premises quote, John says he has a pain. John knows English, and John, oh, the premises, and John is speaking in all sincerity, entail that John has a pain, that pain reports have this sort of special status. But even if this is right, it does not follow that logical behaviorism is correct unless sincerity is a logical construct out of overt behavior. Ooh. This is I didn't expect him to take that tack. That's an interesting take. Let's see what he says about this, and we'll go back and talk about it. A far more reasonable account is this. One can have a pink elephant hallucination, but one cannot have a pain hallucination or an absence of pain hallucination. Simply because any situation that a person cannot discriminate from a situation in which he is himself in pain counts as a situation in which he has a pain. Whereas a situation that a person cannot distinguish from one in which a pink elephant is present does not necessarily count as the presence of a pink elephant. To sum up, I believe that pains are not clusters of responses, but that they are normally, in our experience to date, the causes of certain clusters of responses. Moreover, although this is an empirical fact, it underlies the possibility of talking about pains in the particular way in which we do. However, it does not rule out in any way the possibility of words in which, owing to a difference in the environmental and hereditary conditions, pains are not responsible for the usual responses, or even are not responsible for any responses at all. Let us now engage. All right, so let's read this again here. Hold on. Yeah, okay, we know. All right, let us now engage in a little science fiction. Fun. Let us try to describe some worlds in which pains are related to responses and also to causes in quite a different way than they are in our world. Remember, the point of the world's talk is to find logical incompatibilities, logical inconsistencies that are internal, right? It's a I'm not sure I run to it very often or maybe even ever, but there are a lot of philosophers in our present day who make important points and often they use other worlds talk. So we've just been introduced to it for the first time, which is the only reason I'm underlining it. We're going to see it a lot of times and get sick of it perhaps. But one of the main aspects of this is to figure out what the meanings of the words are, finding clarity about the words we're using and the concepts we're using as well by imagining, like, by seeing what would happen when we imagine trying to use those words when the situations are different, and seeing if it's logically impossible to use the words if other things are different, right? If other things are different, the words don't have any meaning anymore. That, hey, we found the difference. That's the thing in our world that really means something for the meaning of this word, right? Okay. And likewise, if we can change all those things and yet the word still refers to the same thing we know it to mean here, then all of those things are not the necessary parts of the definition that are the essence of the thing, which is what he's probably going to do here, right? So if we confine our attention to nonverbal responses by full-grown persons for a start, then matters are easy. Imagine a community of super Spartans or super Stoics. That's cool. A community in which the adults have the ability to successfully suppress all involuntary pain behavior. I didn't read this ahead, I swear, but okay, we can see the way he's thinking and what he's going to do here. This is kind of cool. They may, on occasion, admit that they feel pain, but always in pleasant, well-modulated voices, even if they're undergoing the agonies of the damned. They do not wince, scream, flinch, sob, grit their teeth, clench their fists, exhibit beads of sweat, or otherwise act like people in pain or people suppressing the unconditioned responses associated with pain. These are perfect Stoics, super Spartans on an island somewhere or on another planet. You shoot them in the chest with an arrow and pour salt in it and shove it in there. And they say, "How do you feel?" They say, "Well, I'm capable of letting you know that it's certainly not one of the more pleasant experiences I've had in my life." They just deadpan. I was like, "Are you in pain?" "Oh, yes." "Oh, yeah. Yeah, I am. We've got something to do here." Right? They show no outward signs, except of course they have the capacity to answer yes, which is normally taken as an outward sign by the behaviorist. But we can imagine where he's going with this. He's going to say, now imagine that they're all under a solemn monk's oath to never admit to being in pain or something, right? And then that would take that one away too. All right. So even if they are undergoing the agonies of the damned, they do not win screamers. Otherwise, the people in pain is suppressing the unconditioned responses with pain. They don't even show the signs of suppressing the responses. Okay. However, they do feel pain and they dislike it just as we do. They even admit, so this isn't an island or a planet of masochists. This is an island or a planet of super Spartans or super Stoics. They hate pain. It feels horrible to them. It's the exact same thing we have, but they are just absolutely perfect in suppressing it and even suppressing the signs that they're suppressing it. We know what he's saying. Okay. They even admit that it takes a great effort of will to behave as they do. It is only that they have what they regard as important ideological reasons for behaving as they do, and they have, through years of training, learned to give up to their own exacting standards. It may be contended that children and not fully mature members of this community will exhibit to varying degrees normal unconditioned pain behavior, and that this is all that is necessary for the ascription of pain. On this view, the sine qua non of the significant ascription of pain to a species is that its immature members should exhibit unconditioned pain responses, right? Imagine what the objection of the behaviorist is, and he's going to try getting rid of them, right? We might say, what happens if a disease wipes out all young people? And now for the next 30 years, it's all stoic adults who suppress their pain. And that's all that is there. One might well stop to ask whether this statement has even a clear meaning. This is what the behaviorists are going to do, right? Supposing that there are Martians, do we have any criterion for something being an unconditioned pain response for a Martian? Other things being equal, one avoids things with which one has had painful experiences. This would suggest that avoidance behavior might be looked at for a universal unconditioned pain response. However, even if this were true, it would hardly be specific enough since avoidance can also be an unconditioned response to many things that we do not associate with pain, to things that disgust us or frighten us or even merely bore us. Let us put these difficulties aside and see if we can devise an imaginary world in which there are not, even by lenient standards, any unconditioned pain responses. Specifically, let us take our super Spartans. And let us suppose that after millions of years, they begin to have children who are born fully acculturated. They are born speaking the adult language, knowing the multiplication table, having opinions on political issues, and inter alia sharing the dominant Spartan beliefs about the importance of not evincing pain, except by way of a verbal report, and even that in a tone of voice that suggests indifference. Then there would not be any unconditioned pain responses in this community. Although there might be unconditioned desires to make certain responses. Desires, now another mental term, doesn't get the behaviorist out of the problem there, which were, however, always suppressed by an effort of will. Yet there's a clear absurdity in the position that one cannot ascribe to these people a capacity for feeling pain. So he's saying, I'm getting rid of all the things you behaviorists want to say is all that pain means. Are you telling me it's absurd to say that these guys are feeling pain? It's absurd to say they don't feel pain. To make this absurdity evident, let us imagine that we succeed in converting an adult super Spartan to our ideology. Let us suppose that he begins to evince pain in the normal way. Yet he reports that the pains he is feeling are not more intense than the ones that he experienced prior to conversion. Indeed, he may say that giving expression to them makes them less intense. In this case, the logical behaviorist would have to say that through the medium of this one member, we had demonstrated the existence of unconditioned pain responses in the whole species, and hence that ascription of pain to the species is logically proper. But this is to say that had this one man never lived, and had it been possible to demonstrate one indirectly via the use of theories that these beings feel pain, then pain ascription would have been improper. What's he doing? He's making up an alternative world to say, look, if you stick with the behaviorist definition of things, you lead to contradictions. The evolution of this super Spartan Martian planet population over millions of years, their children are born just like they are, and there's no signs. We discover them then, and we land on their planet, and we say, I wonder if these creatures feel pain, because of course that's the type of question we are asking. Probably because they have oil. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so we want to know if they feel pain. And the behavior says they don't show any signs, and that's all that pain means. He says, okay, but what if I could convert one out of they say they do, but they do it in a way that isn't the way you would if you were having pain. They say that they have a religion that they're born with and fully ascribe to that says to suppress all outward signs, even of the suppression of the feeling of pain, and they all adhere to that 100%. But they're telling us that. They're explaining to us, "Oh, yes, yeah, when we stub our toe, we notice that when you stub your toe, you it's so amusing to us, but you grab your foot and you go, "Owie, owie, owie." But we understand the impulse to do that for sure because the experience is quite horrible. But we never show any signs of that. Well, the behaviorist would say having that conversation is showing a sign of it, right? And so he says, "Okay, well, imagine they never tell us about it. What if another tenet of their faith is to never admit to any of this?" Well, so then a theorist, he says, where's the logical impossibility of this, behaviorist? That I, as a crazy mad scientist, think they still feel pain anyway. And I take one aside and I live with him for 25 years and I slowly convince him. I say, look, we know that you never admit to feeling pain, but I believe you really do. And I want to know if you really do. And so um, I think your whole religion is wrong and that you should give it up. And you should admit that you feel like grabbing your toe and going owie, owie, owie when you stub your toe, and you should actually give full vent to that because it's actually the right way to live. That's the way we live, and it actually lessens the pain, which is obviously a good thing. And for years and years, I convinced this person to finally be like, you know what? Fine, I'll admit it. It hurts like a motherfucker. All right. As soon as that happens, as soon as he says that, all the behaviorists go, we have evidence they all experience pain. But if he doesn't ever say that, all of the behaviorists say there's no way they experience pain. What pain means is outward signs of evidence, and they don't even talk about they report that they don't feel pain. There's no reason to think that they feel pain. And all Putnam is saying is, did they just start feeling pain when they finally admitted it? Or were they always feeling pain, and pain is something other than outward signs? That's his point. S Said that way, right, you can it's a pretty strong point, right? Obviously, they were always in pain. What if that guy never no, just imagine, what if that guy never did deconvert from their ideology, and they all just kept there's nothing logically impossible for the idea that they actually all feel pain the exact same way we do. Doesn't mean that they do. Now, the behaviorists would respond with, "What the heck are you talking about? They never say they feel pain. They never show any signs of pain. You're telling me they feel pain. They're a blessed species of people who don't feel pain. Obviously, ask them yourself. They'll tell you." Right? In that situation, it would be pretty hard for somebody to actually argue that they do have something like our subjective experience of pain. But that's not the point. Putnam's point is all it would take would be one of them to admit, "Oh my God, it hurts so bad. I really want to scream, fuck, 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 that hurts. But I can't because, we have this ideology. But hey, I just broke it. So let me tell you, owie, owie, owie." And then Putnam says, okay, if he ever did that, even once, even if you knew these people for 1,000 years and he does it once, that means they were always feeling pain the whole time. You just didn't have any evidence of it. Maybe it's right to not say you think they have pain until there's evidence of it. That's fine too. That's not the point. The point is you defined pain as the evidence. Clearly, it's not because they had it all that time that there was no evidence. And now you realize that looking back on the history books, you can rewrite them to the creatures who feel pain rather than the creatures who don't feel pain did this today. It was true that they felt pain when there was no evidence. So pain doesn't mean the evidence of pain. That's his philosophical point here, right? Okay, I think it's pretty clear. Let's see. We have so far been constructing worlds in which the relation of pain to its nonverbal effects is altered. What about the relation of pain to causes? This is even more than verbal effects is altered. I'm sorry. This is even more easy for the imagination to modify. Can one not imagine a species who feel pain only when a magnetic field is present, although the magnetic field causes no detectable damage to their bodies or nervous system? If we now let the members of such a species become converts to super Spartanism, we can depict to ourselves a world in which pains, in our sense, are clearly present, but in which they have neither the normal causes nor the normal effects apart from the verbal reports. What about verbal reports? Some behaviorists have taken these to be the characteristic form of pain behavior. Of course, there is a difficulty here. If I am in pain means I am disposed to utter this kind of verbal report, to put matters crudely, then how do we tell that any particular report is this kind of verbal report? The usual answer is in terms of the unconditioned pain responses and their assumed supplantation by the verbal reports in question. However, we have seen that there are no logical reasons, that's the point of the other worlds talk, for the existence of unconditioned pain responses in all species capable of feeling pain. There may be logical reasons for the existence of avoidance desires, but avoidance desires are not themselves behavior any more than pains are, right? That's what we said earlier. If it goes to desires to suppress the pain response, well, desires were another thing the behaviorists said had to be redefined in terms of physicalistic terminology, or else it had no meaning. Once again, let us be charitable to the extent of waiving the first difficulty that comes to mind, and let us undertake the task of trying to imagine a world in which there are not even pain reports. I will call this world the X world. In the X world, we have to deal with super Spartans. These have been super Spartans for so long that they've begun to suppress even talk of pain. Of course, each individual X worlder may have his private way of thinking about pain. He may even have the word pain. As before, I assume that these beings are born fully articulated. He may think to himself, this pain is intolerable. If it goes on 1 minute longer, I shall scream. Oh no, I mustn't do that. That would disgrace my whole family. But X worlders do not even admit to having pains. They pretend not to know either the word or the phenomenon to which it refers. In short, if pains are logical constructs out of behavior, then our ex-worlders behave as so as not to have pains. Only, of course, that they do have pains, and they know perfectly well that they have pains. Right? The point isn't even that you could figure that out in such a situation. The point is that there's nothing logically impossible about what he just described, which means that the whole meaning of the term pain isn't just in these other things the behaviorists want it to be. Okay, we're almost done. If this last fantasy is not, in some disguised way, self contradictory, then logical behaviorism is simply a mistake. Not only is the second thesis of logical behaviorism, the existence of a near translation of pain talk into behavior talk, false, but so is even the first thesis, the existence of analytic entailments. Pains are responsible for certain kinds of behavior, but only in the context of our beliefs, desires, ideological attitudes, and so forth. From the statement X has a pain, by itself, no behavioral statement follows, not even a behavioral statement with a normally or a probably in it. In our concluding section, we shall consider the logical behaviorist stock of countermoves to this sort of argument. If the logical behaviorist's positive views are inadequate owing to an oversimplified view of the nature of cluster words, amounting in some instances to an open denial that it is possible to have a word governed by a cluster of indicators, all of which are synthetic, his negative views are inadequate owing to an oversimplified view of empirical reasoning. It is unfortunately characteristic of modern philosophy that its problems should overlap three different areas. To speak roughly, the areas of linguistics, logic, and the theory of theories, scientific methodology, and that many of its practitioners should try to get by with an inadequate knowledge of at least two out of the three. Okay, so you can see that's kind of a first response to that pretty powerful pro behaviorism essay we read before. But it's also clear that that's not the final word, that the behaviorists are going to come back and they're going to say, now, wait a minute, hold on, let's talk about your other worlds a little bit here. What do you mean there's pain there? That kind of a thing. They're going to have responses. And so we're going to have to continue the conversation. We've got more essays to read. A quick sum up of what he accomplished or tried to accomplish philosophically here is this. He set the stage by saying there's dualism and there's monism, and now these logical positivists had come in with this behaviorism talk. We can translate mental talk into physicalist talk. Is it really a third alternative? He says what it hinges on, what its foundation is based on the idea that the only meaning of mental terms is stuff that can be translated without change or loss of content into other statements that are purely about physicalistic things that can be observed. I can prove that's not true, he says. Let's take some hypotheticals. What you're saying is the cluster of behaviors, some subset of which normally are associated with any individual who's in pain. No, not even with the normally on there. Okay? We're only 9 billion people on this planet. There could be a planet of 100 billion people who are all super stoics and super Spartans. They all feel pain and they are all born with the conviction that one should never admit to feeling pain or even have a conversation with another person about the fact of feeling pain. What's logically impossible about that? Clearly, the word pain is not referring to a cluster of behaviors, not even ones that normally attend. That's the thrust of what he's saying. Now, just to give an idea, this is cool because this is only our second dip into the pool here, right? Right, we made it out of that historical background stuff, and now it's like, whoa, these are some heavy boxers here, and we're just starting to get into it. I mean, this whole behaviorism thing is going to be kind of thrown to the wayside. We're going to get into functionalism right after this, so they're really diving in, and there's a lot of contention here, and some pretty strong arguments, and some interesting ways of thinking. One of So, what's a something comes to mind of a characteristic way of alright, so let's imagine the way behaviorists might respond to this. When we get to the AI section, we're gonna have probably conversations of this sort. It's analogous. It's just I'm taking arguments in the field of mind philosophy so we can see just sort of one of the things that's nice to do about the camps is to find out that really narrow but like almost bottomlessly deep gulf between them, right? The closer you can get it, the more you can be like, wow, that's the difference between these guys. So there's hmm, the Turing test. Remember the Turing test for AI? If a computer can convince a certain percentage of people that it's not a computer when they're talking with it, then the thing is intelligent. It's using language intelligently. That idea. Um, we're going to read some really cool counter arguments, similar to what's happening here. We're going to read some counter arguments from philosophy that say no, Chinese room, all this other stuff, not it doesn't understand the meanings of the words. It's using the language. It's not intelligent. La di da. What's really funny about that debate, and what I think is going to start to happen here between the behaviorists and their critics, although they are going to morph into functionalism at some point because behaviorism mostly is thought of, I think, today as untenable by everybody. I could be wrong about that. There's probably some behaviorists, philosophical. There are certainly psychological behaviorists, but that's a different thing, right? But philosophical behaviorists about the mind, there's got to be some. But in any event, uh, if you think to yourself, which you're probably not thinking, but if you think to yourself, "Wow, Putnam just buried behaviorism," it's like, nah, these guys are coming back. They're going to come back and they're going to look at all these arguments and all of these mind thought hypothetical other world experiments, and they're going to prove how they were right all along, and how what these mind experiments prove is just how right they were. Right? It might be hard to see, and I mean, it doesn't matter what I think, but I tend to think Putnam is more correct about this. But it doesn't matter. So the Turing test. Well, what if you could create an AI that it could answer any English question perfectly every time? Whatever you ask it, it's going to answer it correctly. It's going to answer it meaningfully. I don't just mean it's going to have the correct answer. I mean its response will be fitting. There are philosophers who are going to make some really powerful arguments that doesn't mean the thing knows what the words mean. It doesn't mean that the thing is intelligent. It doesn't mean that the thing is using language, really. I mean, it's manipulating language, but it's not using it. There are going to be people making powerful arguments of the same type of nature as Putnam's making right here on this other topic. What's funny is that the people who have the opposite instinct, they respond with, yeah, sure. No, that's what it means to know and use a language. So, for instance, uh, these philosophers who they're gonna be good arguments. They're strong. Hey, no, it's a computer program. I could not know the meanings of the English words, but I could follow a lot of rules that would make me use the ones that would be fitting, and I still don't know what any of them mean. And the other side just goes, "You don't know what they mean? What it means to know what a language means is how to use it properly. That's all it means, and it's not referring. There's no content that it refers to beyond that. It's just you're using it properly, and that's what it means to know a language." And then some people think, well, that sounds silly. You have to know what the words are referring to really use the language. The other side comes back with this. They say, okay, if I ask your computer program, a capital letter D falls on its back over a lowercase letter J, what kind of weather does that make you think of? And it responds appropriately. I won't say what the answer is because this is actually a question that I use to test if I'm talking to AI when I am dealing with people over the phone and through supposed chat help things online. Um, if it can answer that correctly, how are you going to say that it doesn't know the language, right? I mean, unless you just programmed it to answer that one question correctly. But if it could answer all possible, right? Like that's really the other side's going to say, really, really. The thing responds with, well, that kind of looks like a this to me, and that kind of reminds me of this kind of weather. What? That's the way you responded to that question, and I still think maybe you don't know the language and the words don't mean anything to you? Now, I happen to be on the side that says, "Yeah, of course, the words don't mean anything to them. There's tells, you can figure it out." But the other side, and this is what I mean by both sides can sort of be totally agreed about the facts of even the hypothetical and have the exact opposite inclination, the exact opposite instinct. And we're going to see that that's really going to be a stark feature, I think, of a lot of the different subjects of this book that we're going to read and the arguments that we're going to get into. So, in any event, we'll leave that as a taster, a teaser of what might be coming. But we've now read our second essay on behaviorism. And last time I immediately stopped the recording and we went to an after conversation. And then you had so many things to say that were so valuable that I kind of wished we had kept the recording going first. So, what I'm going to do is shut up now and say, give us your thoughts, anything you want to add to this before you and I go into the after conversation where we'll talk a lot more about all of this and in the unrecorded part.
I enjoyed the essay because I think it's a prime example of why behaviorists hasn't continued to exist, why it reached a plateau.
Yeah, I think your and my instincts, unfortunately, are pretty much the same on this behaviorist thing. But I think, yeah, I think you're right. I think Putnam is really pointing to the fact that you can't reduce the meaning of these mental terms. He sticks with pain here to just look. I can come up with a world where nobody gives you an outward sign, but they could still have pain, and there's nothing logically impossible about that. Um, I think that the Platonic instinct in philosophy is like, wait a minute, you want to disregard the one thing that I think most matters, which is my internal, subjective, mental, intellectual relationships of all these things and my engagement with them. That's the thing you want to throw out entirely and just make it about the robotic things that we can measure. Um, Clearly, both sides of the conversation have a germ of truth. They've got something to say. It's why they're always still here talking to each other. But yeah, behaviorism is going to be like something I think you and I, from our temperaments, are going to be more allergic to, which is going to be important for us to give it its due. You know, we're doing this, but we're going to have to, not dismiss it too readily or something, because the behaviorists have an opposite instinct to the ones that you and I have. But yeah, I agree with you. Putnam does a pretty good job of, and he's doing it in this contemporary style that the present philosophy has, of talking about other worlds. He's using a lot of and he actually sums up quite nicely that modern philosophical advancement is made through the consideration of linguistics, logic, and the theory of theories. And it's like what he's accusing the Vienna Circle of doing is using the language game talk, analyzing it, being evidentialists. They kind of got their theory that they're bringing to it, and but they're not really they've got their logic, but hey, look, I Putnam can come play some linguistic games and look at the way the words are used and use logical ideas of looking for incompatibilities or inconsistencies that are internal and talk about other worlds. And it turns out I found some meaning in these words that's not the only meaning you thought they had by your linguistic analysis of the way that the words were being used. So, um, yeah, he thinks they did a piss poor job of it. I mean, I don't think he's trying to insult them too much, but he's certainly, uh, I think he does a good job. I agree with you. I think he does a good job of pointing out that the words are referring to something other than a cluster of ways that we can measure whether or not a person is actually in that state. Um, So how are you liking these first two essays? I mean, it's been a long time. We've been doing a lot of other stuff to lead up to this, but the main thing that I think we wanted to do was to dive into mind philosophy. We've barely gotten into this one section. There's a lot more sections I think that we're both going to find more interesting than this as well. But these are our first taste of our intro survey into mind philosophy. Maybe I should ask you that after the recording. But are you disappointed that you wanted to do this so badly, or are you starting to think, okay, wait a minute, I can't wait to see what comes next, because I think we're really going to get into some depth here of something I really want to know about? Or are you
I
still
mean,
thinking to yourself, maybe?
my assumption with this and everything else we're covering, you're taking it step by step.
Yeah, fair enough.
I can't expect to let's say to run, there's some foundation that needs to be laid, and look, understanding
That's
these,
proper.
yeah, understanding these different philosophies, whether you agree with them or not, had some, well, validity from some groups at some point, and then there's
Yep.
another philosophy that came along, right? So I think it's
Abs
important to see it through all the different lenses that are out there. So is this, would I say, the most, I don't know, exciting and interesting?
right.
Perhaps not, but
Definitely not.
I know the best is, is
Okay.
still to come. Isn't
Now, I agree with you on that. One other thing I want to highlight really quickly, though, is that if what you're looking to do is to formulate your conception of the mind and try to figure out with some clarity what questions at least you think are most interesting to keep working on and which ones are maybe not meaningful and all of that, working out your own philosophy. In order to do that is to have conversations with people from other perspectives. So, in addition to everything you said, which is correct, it's also important to know that there are people who think this way, and when you're formulating your theory, you're going to want to know how to talk to them about that theory and where they're coming from and what they're likely to misunderstand and what kind of arguments would do best to uh, sort of make your point, despite the fact that they're not inclined to see it, but they are inclined to see, maybe weaknesses of it from their perspective that you'd be missing, right? So it's going to be beneficial, even if you and I both don't think, oh yeah, behaviorism, we got our answer or anything like that.
Yeah, I certainly agree to that. It's that needs to be part of the input of coming to any of the conclusions. So yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
I
this is sort of the nature of the conversation. If we want to be a part of it, we got to know how to, we got to know what the conversation's all about. So, good. Let's go to the unrecorded part and let's talk more about, especially a couple of these sentences and paragraphs that maybe perhaps um, could stand being looked at a little more closely. All right, so we'll end the recording. We'll see y'all next week. And let's go do this now.